So hi everyone, my name is Melissa Tumas, and I am the Sexual Assault and Relationship Violence Specialist in Health and Wellness here at the University of Washington. My role is to be an advocate for student survivors of sexual assault and relationship violence, and also provide prevention programming across campus. So the session today will examine many risk factors related to sexual assault in the college setting. We will discuss the characteristics of perpetrators of sexual assault, the typology of undetected sexual assault offenders, and the role alcohol plays in perpetration. We will look at research into examining pedagogy and the impact of how we integrate high-risk perpetrator behavior into anti-violence education. And then we will have a discussion about the implications for prevention and intervention programming, policy development, and the significance in conducting Title IX investigations. This is a very important topic for a number of reasons. As I was just discussing with Dr. Berkowitz the other day, you need to understand perpetration in order to do prevention, and advocacy, and adjudication, and investigation. And you need to understand perpetration in order to fully appreciate the incredible strength and courage of survivors who come forward to tell their story or report their experience. And there's tremendous power in our culture in things that remain unexamined and invisible. And when the behavior of perpetrators, or people themselves, remain unexamined or absent from the media, people tend to create their own narratives of what that person looks like, how they act, or their intentions. So that is why the most current research on perpetrator behavior, and then seeking out the most current research on perpetrator behavior, is of the utmost importance to prevention and response efforts on colleges and universities. So I'm delighted to introduce our panel members. I'll read shortened versions of their distinguished biographies. So Alan Berkowitz is an independent consultant who helps universities and communities design programs that address health and social justice issues. He's editor and founder of the Report on Social Norms and has over 25 years of experience in higher education as a trainer, psychologist, faculty member, and counseling center director. At Hobart and William Smith Colleges, he developed one of the first rape prevention programs for men in the United States and was co-director of the college's highly regarded Men and Masculinity program and chaired the Prejudice Reduction Task Force. More recently, he's been a central figure in the development of social norms theory, is a leader in research and implementation of the model, and has been a consultant for a number of highly successful social norms programs. Dr. Kelly Q. Davis is a research associate professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Washington and has been a licensed clinical psychologist. For over 20 years, Dr. Davis has researched the effects of alcohol consumption on sexual violence, sexual risk, and sexual health. She has served as principal investigator or co-investigator on several research projects related to sexual violence, with grant funding from the National Institutes of Health, totaling approximately $20 million. Additionally, Dr. Davis has over 60 peer-reviewed publications in this area, and has presented her work on sexual violence both nationally and internationally. Dr. Davis also currently serves as a member of the UW's Task Force on Sexual Assault and Prevention. Dr. Luca Lewis is the Dean for Student Success and Retention at Edmonds Community College. Dr. Lewis holds a doctorate in higher education, administration, and education, and has worked extensively in the fields of higher education, teaching a variety of sociology, social psychology, gender, sexuality, and diversity courses and workshops over 13 years. Dr. Lewis's past research has focused on violence against women, specifically prevention and intervention programming on college campuses. As an administrator in higher education, Dr. Lewis has also served in the roles of Title IX investigator and student conduct officer in the Washington State Community and Technical College system. His experience and contributions in teaching violence prevention and intervention programming, training on victimology and perpetrator dynamics, and policy development have helped assist colleges and universities with their strategies in reducing risk and violence. So we're gonna have each of our panel members present for 10 minutes each on their topic of research and interest. And then we will pose questions to the group for discussion. We are going to be passing around index cards for folks who would like to ask questions themselves and then collect them after the presentation so that we can use those for the discussion. So I would like to invite Dr. Berkowitz up to discuss. Thank you.
Hello again. So before I start with the slides, I just want to say that as a prevention professional, very often I'm frustrated with the research. And I feel that the research doesn't help me, and there's gaps, and that it often might not expose the full range of the problem. So I think that's true for perpetrators. I think a lot of us are seeing very complicated situations on our campus that don't fit the profile of the serial perpetrator. And I want to acknowledge that the research I'm presenting doesn't necessarily reflect the whole of the experience of what we have. But in the end, from another point of view, even if perpetrators are heterogeneous, if, for instance, two people have been in a previous long-term relationship and they have like a pattern of being intimate together, and then they end the relationship, and they get back together, and then it seems to be going down the same road, and one person makes an assumption that it's the same it was before, and they go ahead. That person still perpetrated because they made an incorrect assumption and didn't have affirmative consent. But we might not treat that person the same as a serial predator who victimized multiple people as is intentional. So I would argue that we need to have sanctions and responses that reflect the range of perpetrator typologies that we see. And what I'm going to show now is just a little bit of that, especially what we know from the research, and some of it is what a repeat of what I presented this morning. So if we look at what the research tells us, as we talked about this morning, there's 20 to 40% of men who have engaged in coercive behavior. And some of those are initiators, so that means they start in college, but they didn't in high school. Others are desisters, that means they did in high school, but they didn't in college. My opinion about those men is they're very sensitive to the environment. So maybe I was in high school, I was with a group of guys who engaged in problematic behavior, and I kind of went along with it. But then I got to college and I realized that if I'm really like respectful and caring and careful about my intentions, then I can be sexually active without taking advantage of someone, so I give that up. Or the reverse, I come into college and I get in with a group. So those people are people that are more sensitive to the environment and they're not ingrained in the behavior. But then we have the serial predators that we talked about this morning, who is really part of their personality. And as I showed from the study we reviewed, they're probably going to go somewhere else in perp if we bust them out of wherever they are. And they, in terms of actual completed rapes, this is a slide from this morning, do a lot of bad stuff. And the reason I put the last one in bold is because when we're really having questions about victim reliability, we need to really remember that in addition to the trauma of the victimization, that very often the serial predator chooses people who will appear as vulnerable. As I said this morning, there's stalking, there's grooming, there's efforts to increase people's vulnerability, and very often a predator will try and violate your boundaries. So if they get in your space and you don't let them violate your space, they'll go find someone else who will let them. And we can understand why someone who's victimized in the past and been traumatized might have challenges monitoring and asserting themselves about space issues, and that would be someone that a predator would sense was a good opportunity or whatever they would think of it. And we talked this morning about the cognitive distortions, the justifications that really lead that person to feel that what they did was okay. And it's important to know all this also from the point of view of a hearing board, because for instance, if I'm the first scenario that I mentioned and my partner and I had consensual sex for a long time and then we split up and then I made an assumption that wasn't true, and we both have the same exact story about what happened. But in the case of the serial predator, that person has a very different story than the victim, and that person changes his story as you get more evidence. I think those are two different typologies, and those people represent two different kinds of risks to our communities. And we talk later about sanctioning. We could think if there are different ways of sanctioning that are still real, what I would call real sanctions, meaningful sanctions. And as I said, the alcohol is the primary weapon. So in the case of the serial predator, usually it's a he, will get drunk also, or not, excuse me, not get drunk, will drink alcohol also, but only as still staying in control. Whereas that person will get the victim very drunk. And this is one of my frustrations with the research, because the research says both people drink, but we don't tell how much they drink and if they drink in the same way. And in the case of the serial predators, maybe he gets really drunk when he's out with his guy friends, but when he wants to perp, he stays in control. So if the research shows that he's a heavy drinker, that doesn't mean that he's drinking heavily when he's perpetrating. So that to me is really a question that hasn't been answered by the research. But I suspect that his heavy drinking occurs when he's with the guys, and that he needs to stay in control when he's grooming a victim. And the research also shows that some serial predators have their method of choice. So some always use alcohol, some always use violence, and there's some who always use both. As I said, they engage in hypermasculine behavior, and that they use the misperceptions to justify their behavior. And in terms of the last one, they tend to brag about to other men about their exploits. A lot of investigators have found that that's a good investigative strategy, which is they can find the Confederates who heard the bragging and then get them in a position where they fess up to what their friends told them. So we know that not only for sexual assault, but for sexual harassment, for bullying, and for domestic violence, that the men who perpetrate believe in all these myths more and believe that other men believe in them. I want to talk more about the false consensus, which is thinking that you're in the majority when you're in the minority. Actually, I think the research on domestic violence perpetrators was done here by Clayton Neighbors when he was still here. And then the same for bullying, and then for men who endorse rape myths. So it's easy to understand that it's a way of justifying your behavior to yourself if you think it's more normal. In terms of sanctioning, I would argue that campus hearing boards are often naive and unprepared to assess perpetrators. And very often now campuses are assigning this responsibility to investigators and to people with more professional experience. But if we're in a situation where we're hearing these cases, we need to really be knowledgeable about the different perpetrator typologies, the different methodologies, etc. And also the way people might even act under questioning. Like I said, a serial predator will admit to as much as he thinks you already know. And then when you come in with new evidence, he'll say, oh yeah, that's true, and then he'll change his story to fit the new evidence, and it will keep going that way, and that needs to be confronted. Whereas, I don't want to say the less culpable perpetrator, because that wouldn't be good to say, but the person who tells you the same story as the victim and there's no disagreement about what happened, that person is not intentionally lying to you, and that's information for you to consider. I just want to emphasize that always the most important criterion of everything we do is victim safety and healing, but that in some cases, maybe the victim, maybe in the case where they had the previous relationship, that victim doesn't want the person kicked off campus, and maybe there might be another legitimate sanction approach that would be empowering for the victim and still produce safety for them in the campus and not put other people in danger in the future. So I'm throwing that out as questions for us to think about. As I said, perpetrators are not a homogeneous group, and that it may be appropriate to apply differential sanctions to different types of perpetrators. So we should always have foremost facilitating the healings of victims and ensuring their future safety. So in the case of the serial perpetrator, where this person is likely to do it again, it's not only about the healing process and justice for the victim, but it's about preventing future harm, and this person is a danger to the community. And there's debates about educational sanctions, and we may talk about this more in the panel, but I just wanted to say my personal opinion that an educational sanction is not a sanction. That's not really sufficient response to taking advantage of someone else in an intimate situation. So a potential sanction could be a warning, it could be probation, it could be loss of privileges, it could be fines or restitution, it could be discretionary sanctions, it could be residence hall suspension, it could be suspension or expulsion. And one thing that's important about all these is very often campuses sanction someone and then they don't follow up to see if the sanction conditions are being observed. So what I would argue that it's absolutely essential that we have a very strict monitoring system in place to monitor all the sanctions. And if you have the person who fits the serial predator profile who's trying to get away with stuff, he'll try and get away with not observing the sanctions. And so if you can bust that person on that, then you should get them off your campus. You know, like maybe the sanction will be that I'm not allowed to appear in a public event with the victim, and if I appear somewhere and I see they're there, then I need to leave immediately, and instead I'll just stay there for like 15 minutes to really upset her, because that, you know, is my goal. Well, that should be enough to bust me. But then someone has to be monitoring that. So we need to consider the degree of premeditation, if force is used, if the person is willing to accept responsibility, or if they're blaming the victim, and the extent to which the perpetrator claims are corroborated, or the person changes their story, and victim protections and comfort with the outcome. So I would say, considering all that, we might be willing to consider a range of sanctions, and it's always depending on the individual case. So vigorous training of hearing boards, differential sanctions, careful monitoring, which I mentioned, consideration of previous behavior, and create synergy between prevention, risk reduction, and intervention, as I was saying this morning. And I also believe that for certain types of cases, restorative justice can offer some very powerful and viable options. And those of you who know Mary Koss, who all of us probably know, Mary has devoted her life to ensuring that victims get compassionate treatment and justice, and she is now devoting the swan song of her career to exploring restorative justice options, because she feels that the legal system very often is not give justice or healing to victims. So I would say, if you respect Mary Koss, which I do tremendously, we should consider the fact that she's really giving this serious attention, and certainly no one could question her credentials as a victim advocate. That's it. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks for hanging in there today. So today we're going to shift gears a little bit and focus on the role of alcohol in sexual assault perpetration. I've been studying this for the bulk of my career. I do also study the role of alcohol in victimization, and perhaps we can talk about that some in the Q&A or afterwards if any of you have interest in that. But today I'm going to focus on perpetration. And before I get started, one of the things that I want to say is that I'm going to give you kind of a bird's eye view of the research in this area. There are a lot of nuances and details that I'm not going to have time to go into, but perhaps we could talk about those later. But I do want to mention that most of what we know about the role of alcohol in sexual assault perpetration is based on research that focuses on men as perpetrators and women as victims. That is the modal form of sexual assault, and that's why it's been the focus of this work. But we don't know a lot about how alcohol might play into other types of situations, so just take that as you will. Okay, so many of you probably already know this, but about half of all sexual assaults involve alcohol consumption. The estimates range, depending on the study, between 40 to 75%. So on average, about half involve alcohol consumption, and that can either be by the victim, by the perpetrator, or most commonly, both the victim and the perpetrator. And alcohol has very complex effects on both victims and perpetrators. Let's look a little bit about alcohol-involved assaults. What do we know about assaults that involve alcohol versus those that do not? Well, compared to sober assaults, alcohol-involved assaults typically are more likely to involve a casual acquaintance rather than an intimate partner. They're less likely to be planned, so they're more often spontaneous. They're more likely to involve time spent at a party or a bar before the assault occurred. And they're less likely to involve condom use than sober assaults. Now, when we look within assaults that involve alcohol intoxication and look at how the level of intoxication may influence what happens in those situations, what we find is that greater intoxication on the part of the perpetrator tends to be associated with more isolating and controlling behaviors of the victim. Perpetrators tend to be more likely to misperceive the victim's sexual interest the more intoxicated the perpetrator is. And they tend to be more aggressive during the assault itself. Now, some studies have tried to look at perpetrators versus non-perpetrators and compare situations that were consensual to situations that were non-consensual to see if there was a difference in alcohol consumption in those situations. And those types of studies have found that when you compare a consensual incident that a non-perpetrator is describing to a non-consensual incident that a perpetrator is describing, typically the sexual assault will have involved more alcohol than the consensual situation. But when we look within perpetrators and compare those who are sober to those who are typically intoxicated during their assaults, what we find is that compared to sober perpetrators, those who are intoxicated during their assaults tend to consume more alcohol just generally in their lives, and they're also typically consume more alcohol before sexual situations than perpetrators who are typically sober. We also know that compared to sober perpetrators, intoxicated perpetrators report having stronger beliefs about alcohol's effects, both on their own sex drive as well as women's interest in having sex. And they tend to report greater trait impulsivity. One of the things I want to stress in this presentation, though, is that there is a wide variety of heterogeneity among perpetrators. Most perpetrators, as Alan has mentioned, report committing multiple assaults. And so we can ask those perpetrators about those different assaults and what occurred in each one. And when we do that, what we find is that between 20 to 48%, depending on the study, we find that they report they never consumed alcohol before those assaults. But another quarter to half or so of perpetrators report that they always consumed alcohol before they committed assault. And then about a quarter of perpetrators report inconsistently consuming alcohol during their assaults. So we've kind of got three groups of perpetrators here. In one group, they never are drinking before they commit assault. Another group was always drinking before they committed assault. And then a third group where sometimes they were drinking and sometimes they weren't. And in a study that I recently conducted, we found a wide variety and heterogeneity in actual alcohol consumption before these assaults. And this gets a bit at what Alan was saying earlier. There's a wide range here. What we found in this particular study was that on average, perpetrators reported having consumed about 8 standard drinks before they committed assault. But there was a wide range. It ranged from 3 drinks to 26 drinks. Yes, that's a lot of alcohol. What we also were able to do in this study was to compute an estimated blood alcohol level. And so we knew how many standard drinks that they drank. We also knew what period of time they drank those drinks over, and we had their body weight as well. And so we were able to consume an approximate peak blood alcohol level for them at the time that they committed the assault. And what we found was that on average, their estimated BAC was about 0.07. So they were just under the legal limit for drunk driving on average. But if you look at the range, it ranged from 0.01, which is really not that intoxicated, to 0.26. Okay, so it was a wide range of intoxication levels in this study. Alcohol also has heterogeneous effects on folks. We know that a lot of people drink, a lot of college-aged men drink, college-aged women drink, but it doesn't affect everyone the same way. Not everyone becomes aggressive when they drink. It works in conjunction with other individual risk factors. And so we tend to see stronger alcohol effects for men going into a situation who have greater tendencies to misperceive women's sexual interest, who come into a situation with stronger misogynistic attitudes, are lower in mindfulness, have stronger acceptance of interpersonal violence, and have stronger beliefs that alcohol makes them aggressive. And that last point speaks to some possible mechanisms as to why alcohol might have these effects. And I'm just kind of going to go over them quickly here, and we can talk about them more later. But there are two primary mechanisms that we study when we try to figure out how alcohol may influence sexual assault perpetration. The first is pharmacological. Those of you who drink know that alcohol impairs our ability to think and our cognitive ability. And so one line of research looks at the way that alcohol creates this cognitive impairment that reduces people's ability to perceive what's going on in a situation accurately and thus may facilitate sexual assault. Another possible mechanism is more psychological, and that gets at our beliefs about alcohol's effects. How do we think alcohol will influence our behavior as well as the behavior of others? And this gets to using alcohol as a tactic, which again, Alan had mentioned earlier in his talks. We know that victim incapacitation is a commonly used tactic by sexual assault perpetrators, and this typically refers to voluntary alcohol consumption on the part of the victim, not always, but typically. What we find when we look at perpetrators who use this tactic compared to, say, verbal coercion, is that perpetrators who use a victim's alcohol consumption as a tactic tend to be more hostile towards women. They tend to have less empathy. They also tend to report greater drinking problems themselves. And they tend to have stronger beliefs that women are more vulnerable to sexual coercion when drinking. That gets at that point of looking for victims who are vulnerable and then targeting those victims. In a focus group that I was conducting with young men, I had one man say that, well, I picked the sickly one from the herd, meaning that he looks for the drunkest woman in the bar, and if for some reason she's not able to be victimized, he goes to the next drunkest woman. That's how he targets his victims. So just to summarize, we know that about half of sexual assaults involve alcohol, which means that alcohol is a very important risk factor, but it's certainly not the only risk factor. And that alcohol's role in sexual assault varies both between and within perpetrators, and can vary with the amount of alcohol consumed. And so I'm hoping in the discussion we can talk about how policies and interventions should consider these nuances when considering how to intervene around alcohol-related sexual assault perpetration. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I think I'll just hold this. Thank you. So, in the interest of talking about self-defense courses, I do want to talk to you about a couple of things before we start with this. I feel that when I talk about self-defense, and when I've talked about self-defense over the years, people get really passionate, good, bad, and ugly, when we talk about self-defense courses. And I think I'm beginning to understand some of the reasons why people get so passionate. I think that because there's that mind-body connection and how we move our bodies when we talk about defending ourselves more in that classic sense, as it relates to some of the dissonance that we may have around it culturally, institutionally, and interpersonally. I think that's where we sort of get the rub. So that being said, I'm going to tell you today that being a martial artist for the last 15 years and engaging in some of the work that I've done around self-defense courses along with my colleagues, that I don't think highly of self-defense courses in the United States as it relates to men's violence against women. And I'm not saying that to poo-poo it, because I know that there's a long and profound and deep history with self-defense courses, rape empowerment, the defense tactics community and law enforcement, the martial arts community, all of it. It's not to undermine that. It's only today to sort of take a critical lens and a critical look as to what it is that we may be implementing on our campuses that may be doing more harm than good. Okay? So with that being said, I'm sure I'll get lots of questions after, and I'm sure you may have some looming questions as we go along. So I work at a community college as well. So we have a little bit of a, I would argue, a different population because we value open access and open enrollment. So we have some layers when we talk about sexual assault on college campuses and more notably in the community technical college system. In addition to some disparities when we talk about resource allocation. For example, for me, I'm overseeing several departments, and then I oversee the entire adjudication process for our entire campus community, and I also chair the BIT. So I don't have myself duplicated on the campus, but I'm doing those things, and I think that's important to take into consideration as well. So we all know the statistics, right? 1 in 4 women, 84 to 90% of assaults that we know on college campuses are perpetrated typically by people that we know or that we just get to know. And so based on these assumptions, I think it's important that we look at some of the values and assumptions that we build around self-defense courses. I like to start with this question of what do they say a campus rapist looks like? And I think where we get stuck is the prevention intervention methods, okay? And I'm going to speak specifically today about some of the triggers, and triggers in that classical sense, because when I say the term trigger and we talk about this, we're not really thinking about someone that we just get to know or someone that's familiar to us. When we talk about self-defense classes, and again, not to poo-poo RAD or model mugging or some of the other self-defense courses out there, but that's a trigger that we're teaching to. And I argue that we should stop teaching to those triggers, okay? It doesn't do us any good to be looking at this from that approach. And so what I'm going to do, I received my training and education from two, as Alan put it this morning, two pioneers in looking at men's violence against women, Dr. Valerie Russo from the University of Idaho and Don Lazzarini. And we did some research a couple of years ago, 2 qualitative case studies. I examined perpetrator dynamics and instruction attributes, those things that need to be combined in a self-defense course, and then Dr. Russo looked at participant impact longitudinally and qualitatively over a 5-year period of time with the participants that went through that program. And here what you're going to hear her talk about is her experiences going through model mugging back in the 80s. Did anybody go through model mugging back in the 80s? Or know what model mugging is? Yeah, right, okay. Very powerful and profound program, but very interesting stark contrast and distinctions that she makes with the self-defense classes that we ran at the University of Idaho as pilots and her experiences in the model mugging course. So take a listen.
One of the big contrasts between a model mugging course and this self-defense course is the fact that I took a model mugging course back in the 80s, and one of the things that struck me about that course was that every woman in that course successfully completed it. In the final exam, in the graduation, all the women fought their way out of every single scenario. And one of the stark contrasts to this kind of self-defense course is the reality that these students are being faced with the opportunity to test out their own boundaries and limitations, whether they're physical, emotional, psychological. They're coming face to face with the fact of, will they be able to fight? Will they be able to utilize what they learned? And will what they learned work against an unpadded, familiar, nice-looking person, such as someone on a date or someone familiar to them, like the kind of perpetrators that we see on campus across the country.
Does that make sense? Okay, so our self-defense classes really need to reflect that. We know from research that perpetrators who engage in sexually aggressive behavior will use any number of different tools and tactics, and yet what we have typically, what's conveyed, can whoop ass up there. See, when a normal beating just won't do, right? This is sort of that perpetuation culturally of what the outcomes are in a self-defense class. And I think this is really dangerous, right? Because people walk away thinking a certain paradigm and a certain set of assumptions based on something that isn't necessarily real or true when we talk about some of the things that Dr. Davis has talked about here and Dr. Berkowitz has talked about all day today. I think that when we talk about what's emerged and what we see in a self-defense class is the focus on these triggers or a fight or flight response in self-defense classes. And while these are important, because I think we can talk about the range and the spectrum of what we might hope to accomplish in terms of goals and outcomes in a self-defense class, that's not reality. And so self-defense classes really need to, and this is part of putting our thinking caps on and thinking together and really focusing on questions. If we're bringing in canned programs into our institutions around self-defense, like rat and model mugging or any other kind of canned program, we need to be able to customize the curriculum to meet the needs of the campus community. And that means that whatever it is that we build pedagogically has to address those triggers that we typically see in a campus community. Most importantly, if risk reduction programs are implemented or outsourced, we again need to talk about the spectrum of challenges that students may face in this paradigm. So these are some of the themes that emerged from my research. Looking at empowerment versus powerful moments. Valerie talked a little bit about this, that having an unsuccessful attempt at defending yourself isn't necessarily a bad thing. And it's directly connected and related to cognitive dissonance. I don't think cognitive dissonance is a bad thing either when we use it from an educational paradigm. Law enforcement uses it, the military uses it. So I think we can have these conversations and broach them when we talk about civilian self-defense courses, and more notably about the reflection and the mirroring of the kinds of perpetrations that we see on college campuses, but done in a safe way. I don't know if you've ever seen a self-defense final examination. Has anybody ever seen that or participated in one? Okay. There's a lot of cheering going on, and I question the cheering in my research study about what we're cheering for exactly. You usually have someone in the middle of a room with someone typically padded, and there's a lot of folks in that room, that dynamic, that are really actually cheering for the person that's experiencing the test dynamic, right? So what I hear typically is, "Go, kick his ass," right? How many people have heard this? Yes? Right, so that doesn't really emulate and mirror what's going on in real life, okay? So, and I think important too is some researchers that I've had a conversation with in presentations is, what if we have a dynamic in a room where someone experiences silence and feeling through that a little bit? I think that's important. But there needs to be some educational components and outcomes associated with it. Not to mention having perhaps a psychologist in the room when we're talking about having self-defense courses that go where we're challenging and mirroring some of the things that students may be experiencing in their social settings. And then refocusing attention. Refocusing attention meaning that we're focusing the attention on the person that's doing the perpetrating. And we're mirroring that in a self-defense course. So instead of screaming and cheering for someone who is inevitably going to be role-played victimized, that we're focusing and refocusing that attention on the person that's doing the actual perpetrating. That's different. And when people experience that difference, both not just with their mouths, but with their bodies, and their pitches drop when they're yelling at someone that's perpetrating someone else, it's a different dynamic that I think we need to take into consideration, and part of the empowerment bystander approach as well. And just a couple of final things when we talk about pedagogy and practice that emerge from this. It's important to look at environmental attributes. I won't give you too much or render too much in terms of the complexity of my research study. We can certainly have conversations offline about it. But I really focused on looking at environmental attributes that were sort of centered and grounded toward the qualitative paradigm, right? That this is about emulating as much as possible sort of this naturalistic environment. How could we mirror some of the same kinds of social dynamics that students experience inside of the classroom versus making it sort of a lab kind of environment, right? We wanted to, loud music, things that were very distracting, getting students very tired to emulate alcohol use. I mean, that's the only way we could do that without getting students drunk. We couldn't do that in the classroom, right? So looking at perpetrator by typologies and behaviors and incorporating and integrating them into the course curriculum, but done in a safe way, right, where there's some boundaries and people are very clear about the roles and expectations of the people that are in role doing the perpetrating and where to stop. And then using the empowered bystander approach. I didn't really get into my research because I had to kind of put a gate around it. It was getting really big. My dissertation was getting into 700 pages. It was getting atrocious, so I kind of had to boundary that up. But this is really important in terms of integrating this component into self-defense courses, right? That we're having conversations about how behaviors get challenged inside of the classroom and practicing. So practicing calling 911, practicing intervening. It's not going to end in puppies and rainbows for the most part. So I think we have to allow students to try that on and to muck around in it and through it. So just my final thoughts. I think an overall arching philosophy here is that anytime someone's having to go physical with someone, right? If you're having to go physical with someone, the circumstances are pretty far out of control. It's in all likelihood that something is going to end up in injury or broken bones, or some form of not good things both emotionally and physically. And so I think self-defense courses and violence prevention courses have to sort of reflect our understanding of what students are experiencing out there in the world. And right now there's some great research that's going on. Jocelyn Hollander from University of Oregon, some research coming out from University of Washington has really looked at some of these effects and impacts, but there is definitely a need for more. And my final thought here is that when we talk about college perpetration, we're talking about people, men in particular, that facilitate their assaults in a social environment. And it's gotten a lot more sophisticated. And so sexual assault programs and courses and anti-violence courses need to reflect that sophistication and that complexity. Thank you.
So let's get things started while Lee's looking at some questions. So let's kind of start out with prevention because this is what I want to talk about. So what are some of the strategies for prevention programs that can address these co-occurring issues of alcohol and sexual assault? And again, because of this heterogeneity in even drinking and perpetrator behaviors, I'm really trying to figure out how are we supposed to kind of respond to that and how are we supposed to get sort of more sophisticated?
I have three comments. One is, when we talk about bystanders noticing the event and interpreting it as a problem, so that means what are you looking out for? And when we have involvement of alcohol or other means of coercion, we need to educate our campuses about what to look for, like what's a risky situation. So that would be one comment. Another comment, two other comments, just build on my comments from this morning, that I think really any bystander intervention without social norms and any social norms without bystander intervention is weaker than the two together. And because we know the perpetrators use the misperceptions to justify their behavior, and we've also heard from the alcohol presentation that perpetrator beliefs about alcohol also serve as a form of self-justification, then we really have to take away those excuses.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think one component of bystander intervention in particular that needs to get addressed are social norms around alcohol use, and not just social norms around violence and what's acceptable there, but to remember that the bystanders have beliefs about how alcohol affects them and how it affects other people as well. But you have to kind of walk a line, I think, because sometimes those beliefs are self-fulfilling prophecies. And so the more that we say, well, alcohol makes women vulnerable and alcohol does these things, it reinforces those beliefs, which is, it's true, but it's also dangerous because then that can create the situations that we're trying to prevent. And so I think it's important for us to consider that when we're talking about these social norms and the effects of alcohol. And then I think the other piece in particular around bystander interventions is to remember that the bystanders are often drinking. And that may affect how they perceive what's happening in those situations. For a lot of folks, being intoxicated themselves may make them more likely to actually intervene. They'll feel braver, they'll be less concerned about what others are thinking, they may just kind of go for it. But with other folks, it may shut them down. And they may really question, oh, I've been drinking. Am I perceiving this right? Maybe I'm reading it wrong. Maybe it's not really that risky. And so I think we have to think about that and talk about that when we're talking about bystanders. And then to think more broadly beyond bystander interventions and the role of alcohol, is just to remember that alcohol affects different people differently. And it also affects people differently in different situations. And so when we're thinking about our programming, we need to, potentially target the people who are going to be most affected by alcohol, but also to remember that there are going to be variations even within people in different situations. And so when it might affect me in one situation one way, in a different situation it might affect me a different way. And so it's very complex. And so there's not one answer, unfortunately. I wish that there were. But I think that that's the direction that we need to go.
Those are great responses.
They feel even greater with your validation.
So what about prevention programs that can reach sexually aggressive men or men with a history of perpetration, or how do we reach and target a small percentage of the population?
I have one comment. Some of you may know I helped develop Haven, which is the new version of Everfi, and I'm not saying that to promote it in any way, but when we looked at the data from our recent administration, we found that it really pissed off around 20% of the men, and they didn't like taking the course. And my attitude is that's good. If you don't like it, good. Now you know, we stand for some things that you don't like. But I think this is really a big problem, which is we're going to get a lot of pushback from these men that we're talking about. And that's why personally I go for the bystanders. I don't go for finding out who they are and getting them in their own group, because they're not able to feel that they're doing anything wrong. But for sure we can create an uncomfortable environment for them to be in, and that can start even before they arrive on campus by asking them to go through certain trainings that they're not going to like.
I would just add, being in the community technical college system, it's a challenge to address not only bystander intervention, but perpetrator behavior, because we have a lot of significant challenge with students coming into our system. And again, open enrollment is something that the community technical college system greatly values. But a lot of the students that I deal with routinely are students that are coming in and not only engaging in sexually inappropriate behavior, but have some pretty significant psychiatric disabilities. So you've got all these different intersections going on. You've got Title IX, BIT, all sorts of fun. So to get at the layer of bystander intervention and addressing these behaviors, I would argue, I'm not saying that it's hopeless, but I think our focus is on values, right? That if we're driving our conversations around values about what our institutions do and what our institutions don't approve of, I think that we've set ourselves up a little bit better. So for Edmonds Community College, we've been focusing on a poster campaign that's focused heavily on getting folks to report, right? So if you see something, say something. How many people have ever seen that in an airport, on other college campuses? That's the campaign that we're starting with, and then we're going to continue to make it more complex.
So again, considering this research on perpetrator behaviors, How can we tailor prevention programming to queer communities?
You want to take that one down there?
I'll just say two things. One is, in any program that we do on anything, we have a moral responsibility to be inclusive of all of our populations. So if we're giving a generic workshop that is to students in general, we have a total responsibility to acknowledge same-sex violence, to acknowledge violence as a hate crime, to acknowledge all these things, to really stretch people to realize that it happens in all these forms, and even to look things like, perpetrator behavior, like maybe threatening to out someone as a way of keeping them silent. So I think, and that relates to what I said earlier this morning about racial and other assumptions. At the same time, I fully believe that whenever possible that we can get a more homogeneous group and tailor something to that group, we're much better off. So if we're in a position through student groups or enough diversity in our community to offer queer-themed sexual assault prevention workshops in that community, I think that's the prevention modality of choice. But even when we can't do that, we have no right to ignore it.
Yeah, I agree with that. Homogeneous. Is that like smart gay people?
That's why they need.
That was a good one, wasn't it, for the afternoon?
That's why they need.
I'm done here, everybody.
That's why they need separate workshops. They can be shorter because they're so smart.
I know. We're all on the hook now. Trans identity. If you're not up on trans identity and understanding the intersections of our trans culture, you're out of the loop and out of compliance. So President Obama, we got trans in Title IX now. So I think we need to take a real hard look at understanding. We're seeing a lot more. I know for certain at community technical colleges, we're seeing a lot more trans students on our campus. And harassment, bullying, terrorizing trans students is numero uno. It is a big concern that we have on our campus.
I just wanted to add that I certainly understand the push for wanting to intervene and do prevention programs right away with all sorts of different populations. But one of the issues that I have with this, and you alluded to this as well, is that the research base is not there. We don't know much about what works at all for a lot of different prevention programs, and some prevention programs, when we test them, end up creating problems. They end up being iatrogenic. And so I think we need to be really thoughtful about just throwing programs out there and trying them and seeing if they work, because odds are they might just be ineffective, but there is a possibility that they could create some harm. And so, I think we just need to think about that going forward. More research money, please.
Thank you. So here's a question from the audience. At our university, we are experiencing a kind of backlash to the attention being paid to sexual assault and victims, along the lines of "our poor boys" or "what about girls who lie?" What are effective strategies to respond to such a backlash?
Okay. First of all, backlash is good because it's bringing stuff out in the open. So if you do good work about anything, you can expect to have a backlash. And then it's just like your next step, how do you address this? So, if we have all the poor boys talking about false accusations, we know those are hugely overestimated. So then I would just say, there's always a conversation to have a conversation and to take the backlash seriously. And, to say, tell me why this really bothers you, and just engage in a conversation and then put the information out there. So we can't be afraid of backlash, because if we, like the first time I went on television talk shows, I got hate mail. And it really threw me for like a week. I felt so vulnerable and violated. And then I thought, this is nothing. Like, no one actually did anything to me. And then I thought, well, what am I doing this for? If everyone loved this, we wouldn't be doing it. So backlash is just part of the work. But then you have to respond to it in a thoughtful way that takes it seriously and addresses the assumptions that are underlying it, which are usually misinformed.
Yeah, I like that. I don't necessarily like backlash, but I kind of like it because it, people are wearing the gun on the outside of their pants, right? Then you can cultivate strategies, meaningful, intentional, mindful, collective strategies to address it. So I like that.
And by the way, we haven't talked about it at this meeting a lot, but everyone should read the literature on false accusations because it's very strong now, and the actual rate of false accusation is like 3 to 5%. So I call men have a false fear of false accusation.
I feel like answering this question a bit myself, actually, but is that all right? I think, when I talk with groups of men, like fraternities or the football team, as I got the lovely honor of doing this year, I do a lot of work up front to sort of reduce defensiveness. And, I'm sure that in the engaging men discussion that happened earlier, which I didn't go to, but, you talk about a lot of things about, men's role and men being allies and men caring about women and men as survivors. And again, all these different aspects of them being a part of the solution and really from that positive, solution-based perspective. And then also when you talk about the dynamics of sexual assault on a college campus and get into really what that looks like, that paints the picture of why students, don't lie and why, it is very rare for someone to come forward considering all the barriers that they face. And so you can even talk about barriers that male survivors face coming forward and sort of relate that to women as well. So depending on how that backlash is looking in any given room or when you're giving presentations, you can do some real work up front to try to lay the foundation and create a safe space. And then recognize that, some of their questions might even sort of seem offensive, but some of them, they may not be. They're really asking questions. And so you do have to respond to them respectfully and sort of kind of roll with that resistance as we sort of teach our peer health educators. And yeah, there's a lot of effective strategies actually, I think. Okay, next question. What effect does popular culture, film, TV, social media have on perpetrator behaviors? I'm zinging you today. Back here.
So I also think that with social media, whether it be movies, songs, or whatever, is actually portraying sexual violence is actually kind of a norm. Dare I say it, listen to some of the lyrics of these songs, and it's like, oh, well, I just did this to the old girl over here, or I just did this to the person over here. And then, like we had a seminar a couple of months ago at JBLM. It was like We End Violence, .com or .org. And the speaker actually pulled the lyrics out, and everybody sang them, and he slowed them down and was like, what is the meaning of this lyric? We broke it down to where it was so powerful that people actually said, I'm not listening to that song ever again because it is relating it to a sexual assault or sexual violence of some way, shape, or form. So to answer your question, I honestly think that with the way it's portrayed now, that we should actually try to alter that portrayal towards more of a positive aspect instead of working so much on the different offensive lyrics and offensive nature.
Yeah, and just to add to that, one of the things that tends to be a consistent predictor of sexual aggression is having an approach to relationships, and particularly sexual relationships, that's somewhat impersonal. So not just assaultive or getting non-consensual, but these kind of casual sexual relationships that don't occur in an intimate partner type relationship. And so I think that the media often portrays those as normative as well. And so kind of going beyond just the violence piece of it, but what sorts of relationships are getting portrayed in the media? Are they healthy? Are they intimate? Or are they just kind of, hey, we're hooking up and I'll never see you again, and that's normal. So I think there's a broad range of things to look at beyond just the violence per se piece of it.
Also, in addition to media literacy and creating different media, we have to remember that the immediate peer group is always stronger in its influence than the influence of media. So if we marshal the influence of the media peer group in a healthier way, that can outweigh the negative influence of the media, even though we should still change the media.
I would just add that deeply concerned, especially when we talk about victims and women of color. I don't think we talk enough about intersectionality and the role that media plays to downplay women of color. And when we talk about victimization, but we need to have, this is a great example of having larger conversations about victimization and women of color. A conference like this, I think we need to have more conversations and broaden and deepen our understanding of not only perpetrator dynamics, the role that media plays in it, but also victimization when we talk about women of color.
Just want to add one comment. So if you pick up a newspaper that advertises escort services, like when I used to live in New York, I would look at the Village Voice. You see that women from every racial group is portrayed in a stereotypically racist way. So Asian women are portrayed in one way, Latin women are portrayed in another, African heritage women are portrayed in another. And you see that part of the oppression is the over-sexualization in different stereotypical ways of different women from different ethnicities. So I would 100% agree that that really needs to be part of how we think. And a good way to see that in action is to read those ads for the escorts.
We have a university attorney on our Title IX task force who is very concerned about perpetrators having equal support services. What are your thoughts? And how can we help her understand a victim-centered approach does not mean we are setting ourselves up for lawsuits from perpetrators?
If the perpetrator is upset, he can go to the counseling center. I mean that in jest, but I also mean that in all sincerity, that if someone feels falsely accused, for example, and it's really producing a lot of emotional distress, help is available. And I would argue that if we understand what we've already heard today about perpetrators, most of the perpetrators are not really interested in getting help. They're interested in not getting busted. But we still have to make the help available. But the perpetrator hasn't been traumatized except by the accusation, or they claim to be, but it's a different kind of traumatic experience that one needs support for. But I didn't speak to a lawyer about that response.
What responsibility do we have to the larger community after a student is dismissed?
Well, I won't speak wholly for Washington State, but we do need to be mindful of duty to warn, duty to protect, depending on the severity and the context of potential harm to the community at large. And I would say that's certainly true for community technical colleges, where we're not just talking about a violation of the student code of conduct that's connected to sexual misconduct. There could be other elements that pose to threat the community or that person to harm themselves. So I think those are some things that we have to be mindful of. Our system is very interesting. We're connected, but we're not connected. During the budget time, we come together like one disgusting amoeba, and we all vie for funding, right? But after that, we kind of go back to our respective campuses. So we're centralized, but we're decentralized, and so we're not yet connected in that way of sharing information from one CTC to another. But that's often what happens, is that if a student is dismissed from Edmonds Community College, let's say, and I make a recommendation to go down to Bellevue College, no? Okay, no? Okay. Or we're having those conversations that we are less likely and less apt to share information unless that student is posing to harm themselves or other people based on whatever the outcome is. So it's tricky, very tricky. And I will also add that Edmonds Community College has a very tight, strong, almost fluid relationship with Edmonds School District, right? They're right in our backyard. And so often we have a huge pre-college division. We have a lot of underage students on our campus, more so than any other institution likely in Washington State. It's a very interesting population, dynamic population, in addition to our international students who are also underage. So we have other things that we have to consider and be mindful of when we talk about duty to warn and duty to protect.
How do you gauge the level of the perpetrator? And what tools do you use to profile? And obviously I think this would be more for investigators or hearing boards. When we talk about these typologies, how are they to determine those profiles?
It's got his name on it.
Well, first of all, I would go to the End Violence Against Women International Conference, because that is a great conference. That organization is here in Washington State, and that conference is for law enforcement, for forensic nurse examiners, for detectives, for victim advocates, and they really work, this piece of the puzzle extensively, including how to do victim-sensitive investigations. So, without being an investigator, I wouldn't be able to say more than I already said, but if you notice inconsistencies in a story, you have to pursue them. If the witnesses have different reports than what the person, and then you have to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. And as I said, in some cases you put all the pieces of the puzzle together and there's no disagreements. And then in other cases you put the pieces of the puzzle together and it will contradict the story. So that's one. You need to have a good enough investigation to expose that. And then it's how the person responds to the inconsistency. And then I think, I think it's really a better question to be answered by an investigator. So we're not going outside of our expertise.
Well, thank you so much.
I want to say something about this.
The note on this card said, P.S. I disagree with restorative justice in sexual assault cases.
So I would just say we're all obligated to read the research. And let's read the research on what's being done and what the outcomes are and how it's being used. And then and then if we've already done that, we make our individual decisions. But there's a lot of good research on it. And as I said, Mary Koss, who deserves a lot of our respect, is really going deep into this.
Well, thank you, everyone. I could really, of course, continue to talk about this through the night, but we will not keep anyone over time. And again, I just want to take a moment to thank our panel members and a friendly reminder to fill out your evaluations, please, for the conference. Thank you so much. Take care.